Welcome to this lecture on the aftermath of World War I. We'll seek to examine what follows after total war in societies bruised and battered by such a conflict. I refer to the aftermath of the First World War as the hinge of violence, because in some sense the war didn't end neatly with the declaration of a ceasefire in November of 1918. Rather, in some sense, in very many important ways, the effects of the First World War would continue. There were hopes vested in the end of the war for a more democratic order of European society in particular, hopes that were shared in other parts of the world for democratic transformation and maybe an end to imperialism. But such hopes would very soon, in the course of just a few years, fall prey to a latent state of strife continuing in world society, not only between nations, but within them as well. One would see vast flows of refugees. One would see disordered societies in which political violence had become common. And intense hopes for democracy worldwide would evaporate all too soon. The results of World War I, thus, would continue as aftershocks long after the war officially ended on November 11th. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, with the declaration of the armistice, the guns finally fell silent. But this simply opened up a period of needing to take stock of what the war had cost. The war had left some 10 million dead around the world and double that number wounded. Many of them, of those who survived, scarred for life, either physically or psychologically. Thus, common monuments to the unknown soldier, the tomb of the unknown soldier, for instance, fittingly symbolize the anonymous mass death that had become common in this total war. Among the living, one spoke of a lost generation, those who were missing, as well as those young people whose lives had been bruised and scarred by the experience of the war. The war also had an intellectual and cultural impact which was significant as well. One might say that the war had in important ways brutalized European societies in particular, producing militarized politics and an even more militarized outlook on life. The literary historian Paul Fussell has suggested that the First World War accelerated a tendency to speak in warlike language, even in the English language itself, to think in terms of polar opposites, us versus them. The wartime expansion of government power had also dealt a body blow to cherished liberal ideals of limited states, individual rights, respect for human rights. The First World War had demonstrated that in an emergency, centralized states would have to fill the vacuum. The lost generation of scarred survivors, as a result, often dramatically and emphatically disavowed their faith in ideals. They felt that those fine, cherished notions for which they had bled and their comrades had died had been exposed as empty and shallow. One work that summed up this ubiquitous disenchantment was the memoir of Robert Graves, entitled, in an evocative title, "Goodbye to All That." Goodbye to the certainties of the 19th century. Goodbye to the hopes of an inevitable progress. Goodbye to the confidence in an ordered society. And the question now arose, what principles would replace those that had been declared bankrupt and finished? Some ex-soldiers in many different countries called for a new kind of politics, one that would reflect their experience in the searing fighting in the trenches, with their encounter with the deadly powers of modernity. Some ex-soldiers would call for what they labeled a new trenchocracy to steer politics. Soldiers who had fought and bled, who had experienced this modern experience of total war firsthand, should reshape societies and politics. Europe, moreover, was on the move as a result of the continuing turbulence that followed upon the aftermath of the First World War. With the collapse of the German Empire, the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, vast borders were redrawn. New independent states were formed. people found themselves living in newly independent countries that had not existed recently, discovering themselves either to be minorities in countries not their own or enjoying independence for the first time. Refugees fled continuing conflict, especially from the lands of the former Russian Empire, where civil war was soon raging. This was truly a vast migration of peoples, echoing that of the times before the Middle Ages. It's estimated that some 3 million people had fled the lands of the Russian Empire by 1921. It represented a vast exodus. It was not uncommon in those days to travel to Berlin or Paris and discover that one's chauffeur was an aristocrat of the Russian Empire, or that the lady behind the counter at a cafe was a Grand Duchess. These were people who were cast adrift on the tides of history. Such stateless people, refugees, displaced, were castaways without clearly defined rights. If they were evicted from a country which no longer existed, what was their place in society? Hannah Arendt, that political philosopher whom we discussed in the first lecture, had argued that such figures, such stateless people, were truly quintessential figures of the 20th century. She argued that the 20th century would be, in a very real sense, the century of the refugee or of the displaced person. Many would share this fate in the following decades. With new frontiers in Europe, especially Central and Eastern Europe, with newly independent countries, some 20 million people now found themselves as ethnic minorities living in countries in which they did not belong to the dominant nationality. As an expedient to deal with these new situations, there was arrived at by politicians the notion of something that's ubiquitously and euphemistically called population transfer. This is a case of a trend that we'll see repeatedly in the course of our lectures, of the power of euphemisms, of code words to cover up harsh human realities. Population transfer sounded and was meant to sound neat, humane, and efficient. The reality, however, was of a brutal uprooting process of populations who were now to be moved around involuntarily. A prime example of this population transfer, which is largely forgotten today, but because of its long-term impact as a precedent for later events, deserves to be far more widely known, came after the war had ended in a new conflict that erupted between Greece and Turkey in the Mediterranean region. This was a crucial case of the First World War continuing after it seemed to have ended. These events that followed between Greece and Turkey were to be an important precedent for later radical measures by states, what euphemistically would be labeled again and again population transfer, and often looked back to this precedent. When Turkey had been defeated in the First World War, Turkish nationalists reacted very fiercely against the treaty that was imposed, they felt, upon their nation, the 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, which was imposed upon them by the Allies, and they resisted. They resisted Allied occupation of coastal areas and launched a national war of resistance against what they felt to be an unfair, dictated treaty, which was led by a remarkable individual, Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, a title that means the father of the Turks, because he led the way in the establishment of a new Turkish national republic from the ruins of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Events had unfolded with drama in this corner of the world at a time when people were largely occupied with the tasks of reconstruction elsewhere. In 1918, Greek armies had invaded what remained of the Turkish Empire to fulfill a nationalist ideology. Their goal was what they called the Megali idea. This was the nationalist dream or utopia of a greater Greece, which would span the Mediterranean, taking in areas in Anatolia and the islands that earlier had been claimed by the Greeks in classical days of glory around the Eastern Mediterranean. These were areas to be reconquered as part of a national mission. By 1921, this invasion had turned into a disaster. Utopia was followed by nightmare. A treaty was negotiated between Greece and the new Turkish state, the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne. It agreed to the principle of compulsory exchange of populations. What followed was a largely unrecorded and today unknown massive uprooting of populations. It's estimated that some 400,000 people of Muslim background, even though they might culturally have been quite well integrated into the surrounding Greek populations, were moved from Macedonia and elsewhere in the Balkans to Turkey, a land that they'd never known, whose culture and environment was often quite foreign to them. Meanwhile, the remnants of classical civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, Greek Christian communities from Turkey, were sent to Greece, and they numbered some 1.3 million. Huge masses of people were moved thus in the aftermath of the First World War. This operation, agreed upon in the Treaty of Lausanne, took place under international supervision. But this international supervision, unfortunately, simply offered a fig leaf of good conscience for a truly brutal process that was unfolding beyond the horizon of international observers, which often included massacres, killing, intercommunal violence, and what we today would call ethnic cleansing. But what it's truly riveting to observe is that in spite of this bloody record of the Treaty of Lausanne, in spite of the atrocities and violence that accompanied the policy of population transfer, the mark that this procedure left in European intellectual history was quite different. It was truly starkly in contrast to the human reality that historians record. It was hailed by European historians of the time as a successful model of problem solving, of the redrawing of borders, of dealing with the supposed problem of ethnic minorities within new national states. And this hailing of so brutal an expedient, this euphemistic policy of population transfer, was truly to have ominous results, because it would be invoked again and again later in the 20th century as a way of, as it were, offering solutions to ethnic problems. Nonetheless, there seemed hopes and expectations for something better. And this was part of a worldwide democratic tide that had followed upon the end stages of the First World War. In some sense, America's entry into that conflict had changed it ideologically. It had infused new ideas and new energies, much as the Bolshevik Revolution and the announcement of communist principles had in the course of 1917 as well. America's entry into the war, led by President Woodrow Wilson, a self-proclaimed idealist, in April 1917, helped to overwhelm Germany's fading war effort and led to pleas for peace on the part of German generals as well as politicians who hoped that the democratic principles Woodrow Wilson seemed to be espousing would augur well for a negotiated settlement. The American President Woodrow Wilson had announced in many ways an agenda radically different from that of the pursuit of a balance of power amenable to themselves pursued by the European powers. He had announced in January of 1918 a democratic agenda in his speech on the 14 points declaring America's aims in the war. Throughout, his concerns were for what he took to be the higher ideals expressed in the American way of life and in the American mission in its involvement in the First World War. He kept his distance from the other Allied powers, declaring America to be an associated power, not making common cause with those imperialists necessarily, and declaring in words that were to be remarkably popular to the ears of Europeans who had suffered through years of war, that this was now to be a war to end all wars, a war to end all wars, and, moreover, to make the world safe for democracy. Arriving in Europe for negotiations upon the war's end, Woodrow Wilson was cheered by massive crowds Crowds as enthusiastic and frenetic, perhaps, as those who had cheered war in 1914 now gathered to proclaim Woodrow Wilson a liberating savior figure upon the end of the war. He enjoyed immense popularity, a popularity that he retains to this day in Eastern Europe, so that in the Czech Republic one encounters streets and railroad stations named after Woodrow Wilson to this very day. At the very end of the war, democratic states had been declared in Central and Eastern Europe, in many cases arising out of the shattered remnants of former empires. And we need to be clear about this. Such new republics and democracies were not only the doing of Woodrow Wilson. So if he is blamed for the instability of the breakup of European empires, that's probably not entirely fair. Instead, Woodrow Wilson was hailed because his ideas seemed to be so consonant with some of the deepest aspirations of many Europeans. New states emerged where none had existed before, in national independent form. From the Russian Empire's wreckage, there emerged an entire band of states, not under the control of the Bolsheviks, who ruled the rest of the Russian Empire, but there now emerged nationally independent Finland, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and the resurrected nation of Poland. Austria-Hungary also broke apart from its once great dynastic unity into the states of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and the reduced state of Austria. Germany experienced a different fate. It changed under the impact of revolution and tried to go a democratic route in the Weimar Republic. With the war lost on November 9th, 1918, a German democracy was declared. It comes to be called the Weimar Republic because of the place where its democratic constitution is written. This government was led by moderate socialists, but they faced challenges on the ground after launching their revolution. The call went out among their former comrades in the radical wing of the socialist movement for a second revolution, a more radical one. Simultaneously, these radical socialists had declared a communist Germany, and they challenged the more moderate socialist comrades of yesterday. It seemed in a very real and threatening sense to the moderate socialist leaders of Germany and the Weimar Republic that the events of the Russian Revolution, when a moderate provisional government had been superseded by the Bolshevik radical revolution, these events seemed to be repeating themselves in Germany. We can see here an ironic progression. The Bolsheviks felt they were copying the events of the French Revolution of the end of the 18th century. Now in Germany, it was feared that the Russian Revolution, imitating the French Revolution, was playing itself out again, a revolutionary formula. Germany would find itself racked by instability as a consequence. But worldwide, there were also continuing hopes in a new organization that sought to ensure that truly this had been a war to end all wars. These were the hopes vested in the now defunct League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson had cherished idealistic plans for a world League of Nations to ensure permanent peace and collective security. And these plans and their idealism created enormous optimism in their day. Non-European representatives of peoples who earlier had been under European colonial rule and still languished under that rule, in fact, sent delegates and representatives to the negotiations in Paris and around Paris, hoping to be heard by the powers, hoping for independence, hoping for a denunciation of imperialism as a now closed chapter of human history. They were to be cruelly disappointed. At the same time as negotiations and discussions continued through the League of Nations, there was also one other element that gave hope in this context. And these were the hopes that were vested in a policy of Americanization. Not a government-pursued policy, but rather that broad cultural influence that the model of the United States would have in Europe. We speak today of Americanization and globalization as new phenomena. They're emphatically not. After the First World War, a hopeful model for social organization that became very popular in Europe was the imitation of youthful America's economic productivity and organization. There was, moreover, one word, one strategy that was synonymous with this trust and optimism vested in Americanization, and that word was Taylorism. Taylorism referred to the scientific management theories that have been promoted by the American efficiency expert and scientist of work, Frederick Winslow Taylor, through his so-called time-motion studies of work, which had very carefully timed for maximum efficiency the movements of workers on the factory floor. Taylor's time-motion studies and that entire philosophy of efficiency called Taylorism were adopted by Ford's moving assembly lines in his plants in 1914. Man and machine were to work together, speeding up production for maximum efficiency. As a result, utopian industrial planning solutions to human problems seemed attractive to many. One of the converts was the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who felt that Taylorism, joined to Marxism, might be exactly what was needed to drive humanity forward down the road of progress. Other critics worried that Taylorism and its ideas of efficiency came at a great cost, and that cost might be the potential dehumanization of workers subjected to such systems. Fritz Lang's classic film, one of the greatest films made, Metropolis, which appeared in 1927, a classic rendering of technological utopia, summed up the ambiguous views on Taylorism. This film depicted a utopia, a future technological society, which was productive, but which had radical differences in class and in social status. The lure that was held out in this film was the possibility that the immense productive capacity of industry that Taylorism promised could somehow be harnessed towards the goal of a true equality and a productivity that all could share in. Meanwhile, the negotiations for the settlements of Paris continued, and they, in some sense, would work to undercut many hopes for stability. At the 1919 negotiations in Paris, a severe peace treaty known as the Treaty of Versailles was drafted with Germany. Though many Germans had assumed they would be included in deliberations on the basis of Woodrow Wilson's democratic slogans, Germans were excluded from those negotiations and would have to wait to hear what had been decided. The treaty, when it came, shocked them. It stripped Germany of territories close to home. It stripped Germany of colonies, placed strict limits on its armed forces, required reparations to be paid, and anathema to most Germans, if not all, forced Germans to accept responsibility for causing the war, the so-called war guilt clause. The blockade which Britain had imposed upon Germany would remain in place until Germany signed. So, to the outrage of Germans, economic hardships continued. The news of the terms came as a crushing blow to Germans. In fact, there was an element of hypocrisy in their outrage, unconsciously, however, in that this treaty was far milder than the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which Germany had imposed on Russia when it had the upper hand. A fundamental problem, which historians of late have been emphasizing, is that many Germans didn't believe that Germany had truly been defeated. Its armies had continued to fight beyond Germany's borders. How could defeat have followed? The home front had held out and had not experienced the devastation that air war would bring in World War II. How then could defeat have followed? This hurried the spread of the so-called stab-in-the-back legend, which allowed German nationalists and generals to claim that the army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but rather had been betrayed by traitorous elements on the home front, blaming the scapegoated groups of Democrats, socialists, communists, and with a sort of grim predictability, given the anti-Semitism of some of these groups, German Jews, who in fact had participated patriotically in the defense of what they considered their fatherland. In spite of protests, German representatives signed the Versailles Treaty on June 28, 1919. This treaty had deep problems. The United States rejected the treaty, feeling that it too intimately bound America into the problems of Europe, and did not join the League of Nations. So one of the great powers was out. Soviet Russia, as a revolutionary state, a pariah, an untouchable, also was not a member. With the United States and Russia not belonging, the two rising superpowers of their day were excluded. While defeated powers resented the settlement, some victors were not happy either. Italy, one of the winners of the war, at least nominally, walked out of the conference because its vast territorial demands were not met. and Italian grievances would have consequences in the rise of the fascist movement that we'll examine shortly. The representatives of non-Western peoples who were gathered received no hearing. They included Vietnamese activist Ho Chi Minh, who would later accede to the ideology of communism. One could see, moreover, in unsettled Europe, a surge of radical revolution. Revolts spread. They were fired in part by the Soviet example and sometimes actually encouraged by the Comintern itself, which sent out agents to further and to encourage such revolts that broke out in Europe. These were revolts that sought to create international civil war, to unleash that world workers' revolution. Red forces, representing the communists, and counter-revolutionary white forces battled in Finland's civil war in 1918, Finns fighting Finns, ending in communist defeat. In Berlin, in January of 1919, the Communist Spartacus organization attempted a poorly organized uprising. This failed, and its leaders, the revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, a remarkable woman, and Karl Liebknecht were murdered by government forces. A later uprising in March 1919 also failed. In November of 1918, Kurt Eisner, a radical socialist down in the south of Germany in Bavaria, declared a socialist republic. After he was assassinated, some of his associates declared a communist republic of Bavaria in April, which was suppressed in May of 1919. It was in this turmoil that an anonymous soldier by the name of Adolf Hitler was observing events in Germany and drawing his conclusions about his own political career. In Hungary, a former prisoner of war who had gone communist while a prisoner of war in Russia, Bela Kun, proclaimed a Soviet state of Hungary in March 1919. It lasted for a remarkably long period, for several months, until August 1919, in part because it was able to rally Hungarian nationalism against Hungary's neighbors to the communist cause. But then ultimately in August of 1919, Bela Kun was deposed and fled. Such revolts, though they were ultimately all unsuccessful, had raised a specter of communist revolutions spread throughout Europe as a whole, and they stirred remarkable fears among Europe's middle classes and would make them all too ready to have sympathies for movements that claim to be working against this threat. The influence of such revolts could also be seen beyond Europe's borders. Worldwide, communist parties were founded with the Comintern's encouragement. It was the policy of the Comintern to cooperate, especially in non-European areas, with nationalist groups, as Bela Kun had done, in fighting against the imperialist powers, to harness these energies and resentments to the cause of leading humanity forward towards a worldwide workers' revolution. The French Communist Party was founded in 1920. Among its founders was Ho Chi Minh, engaged in an internationalist project. In Shanghai, in far-off China, the Chinese Communist Party was founded in 1921 with Mao Zedong, a leader who would play an immense role later in the 20th century among the delegates. At the same time, forces that conceived of themselves as conscious counter-revolutionaries were also mobilizing. In Germany, the democratic government felt forced to employ the so-called Freikorps, or Free Corps mercenaries, to suppress challenges from some of their former comrades, the radical socialists, and to guard Germany's embattled borders. These Freikorps mercenary units had very little sympathy for democracy, but were glad to take the money of the government in order to engage in violence against those whom they saw as their ideological opponents. They saw themselves as perpetrating a white terror of immense brutality in reaction to the red terror that the communists promised in what really amounted to a virtual civil war within Germany itself. The Freikorps were not loyal to the democratic government. Their steel helmets displayed the swastika or broken cross of the ultra-nationalists, not democratic symbols, and they would later turn against that very government. Some Freikorps, in fact, journeyed beyond Germany's borders in 1919 to the Baltic region to continue the war there. Others joined the putsch or revolt attempt in 1920, which failed, and later organized murder squads to kill democratic politicians, and later represented important recruits for the young Nazi Party. The German Democratic Weimar Republic would have its politics marked by political violence and repeated uprisings from the left and the right. One could see, in other words, in Europe and Western civilization more broadly, a fragile stability. With growing economic recovery in Europe, a certain stabilization was experienced from 1924 to 1929 in spite of these problems, but as would be discovered, it rested on fragile foundations. Soon after the initial democratic wave, democratic ideas would all too often be on the defensive or in retreat. And then, when the worldwide Great Depression spread from 1929, this would offer extreme movements opportunities they would try to seize. In our next lecture, we'll consider how in the Soviet Union, the attempted building of a new society and civilization would offer hope and a shining example, so it seemed, worldwide.